all you can do is just get through the day. But other times, you have a day full of meaning, a day that sticks with you forever. All Good Things by Sister Helen P. Rosela. He was in the first third grade class that I taught in St. Mary's School in Morris, Minnesota. All 34 of my students were dear to me, but Mark Eklund, he was one in a million. He was very neat in appearance, and he had that happy to be alive attitude that made even his occasional mischievousness delightful. But Mark talked incessantly. I had to remind him again and again and again that talking without permission is not acceptable. What impressed me so much, though, was his response every time I had to correct him. Thank you for correcting me, sister. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but before long, I become accustomed to hearing it many times a day. One morning, my patience was growing thin when Mark talked once too often, and then I made a novice teacher's mistake. I looked at Mark, and I said, if you say one more word, I'm going to tape your mouth shut. It wasn't 10 seconds later when Chuck blurted out, Mark's talking again. I hadn't asked any of the students to help me watch Mark, but since I had stated the punishment in front of the class, I had to act on it. I remember the scene as if it was this morning. I walked to my desk, very deliberately opened my drawer, and took out a roll of masking tape. Without saying a word, I proceeded to Mark's desk, tore off 2 pieces of tape, and made a big X with them over his mouth. Then I returned to the front of the room. And as I glanced at Mark to see how he was doing, he winked at me. That did it. I started laughing. The class cheered as I walked back to Mark's desk, removed the tape, and shrugged my shoulders. His first words were, "Thank you for correcting me, sister." At the end of the year, I was asked to teach junior high math, and before I knew it, Mark was in my classroom again. He was more handsome than ever, and just as polite. Since he had to listen very carefully in my new math, he did not talk as much in 9th grade as he had in 3rd. One Friday, things just didn't feel right. We had worked so hard on a new concept all week, and I sensed that the students were frowning, frustrated with themselves, and edgy with one another. I had to stop this crankiness before it got out of hand. So, I asked them to list the names of the other students on 2 sheets of paper, leaving a space between each name. Then, I told them to think of the nicest thing that they could say about each of their classmates and write it down. It took the remainder of the class period to finish their assignment, and as the students left the room, each one handed me the papers. Charlie smiled at me, and Mark said, "Thank you for teaching me, sister. Have a good weekend." That Saturday, I wrote down the name of each student on a separate sheet of paper, and I listed what everyone else had to say about that individual. On Monday, I gave each student his or her list, and before long, the entire class was smiling. "Really?" I heard whispered. "I never knew that meant anything to anyone. I didn't know others liked me so much." No one ever mentioned those papers in class again. I never knew if they discussed them after class or with their parents, but it didn't matter. The exercise had accomplished its purpose. The students were happy with themselves and with one another again. That group of students moved on. Several years later, after I returned from vacation, my parents met me at the airport. As we were driving home, Mother asked me the usual questions about the trip. the weather, my experience in general. But there was a lull in the conversation. My father cleared his throat, as he usually did before something important. The Eklunds called last night, he began. Really? I said. I haven't heard from them in years. I wonder how Mark is doing. Dad responded quietly. Mark was killed in Vietnam, he said. The funeral is tomorrow, and his parents would like it if you could attend. To this day, I can still point to the exact spot on I-94 where Dad told me about Mark. I had never seen a serviceman in a military coffin before. Mark looked so handsome, so mature. And all that I could think in that moment was Mark. I would give all the masking tape in the world if you would just talk to me. The church was packed with Mark's friends. Chuck's sister sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But why did it have to rain on the day of the funeral? It was difficult enough. The pastor said the usual prayers, and the bugler played taps, and one by one, those who loved Mark took a last walk by his coffin. I was the last one to bless the coffin. As I stood there, one of the soldiers who acted as pallbearer came up to me. Were you Mark's math teacher? I nodded as I continued to stare at the coffin. Mark talked about you. A lot, he said. After the funeral, most of Mark's former classmates headed to Chuck's farmhouse for lunch. Mark's mother and father were there, obviously waiting for me. We want to show you something, his father said, taking a wallet out of his pocket. They found this on Mark when he was killed, and we thought you might recognize it. Opening the billfold, he carefully removed 2 worn pieces of notebook paper that had obviously been taped, folded, and refolded many times. I knew, without even looking at the papers, that those were the papers that I had listed all the good things Mark's classmates had said about him. Thank you so much for doing that, Mark's mother said. As you can see, Mark treasured it. Mark's classmates started to gather around us. Charlie smiled rather sheepishly and said, I still have my list. It's in the top drawer of my desk at home. Chuck's wife said, Chuck asked me to put his in our wedding album. Then Vicky, another classmate, reached into her pocketbook, took out her wallet, and showed her worn and frazzled list to the group. I think we all saved our lists. And that's when I finally sat down and I cried. I cried for Mark and for all of his friends.